I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Wendt Character Initiative and the University of Dubuque. I'm Anna Lee Ward, privileged to be the director of the Wendt Center for Character Education here. This is a center which works across campus to encourage lives of purpose and excellent moral character that develops virtues such as integrity and justice and compassion. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, I'd like to open with a word of prayer, as is our habit here. Gracious and loving God, thank you for another day of life, for callings to engage your world in meaningful and visionary ways, for friendships, and most especially for homes. We come together tonight full of the day's busyness, challenges, and opportunities. Sweep out the clutter in our minds and empower us to be stewards of our listening and our speaking. In your wisdom, you created humankind in this world. Through the power of your word and spirit, you sustain us. Yet, Lord, we get discouraged. We see and too often know the violence and destruction, the hurt and suffering of human existence, and we long for visions of hope. Forgive us for not taking responsibility, for not working for change, for our selfishness and lack of compassion. Thank you for Brian Walsh, his passionate pursuit of justice and his willingness to share in teaching us more about ways to build a sense of belonging and a place to call home. Grow us into people whose many gifts serve your world and reflect your goodness, we pray. In the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, amen. Deeply intellectual, passionate about following Christ, yet down to earth, often literally on his off-the-grid farm, and one who seeks to navigate culture by providing both critique and visions of hope. That's a start on a description of Dr. Brian Walsh. Wine before breakfast? That too is part of his passion. He comes to us from the University of Toronto in Wycliffe College, where he teaches at the intersection of theology and culture and is a Christian Reformed Church campus minister. In the words of one of his students, he's, quote, "my favorite because he is a radical and a creative prof." And the wine before breakfast? That's a weekly morning community that they've started, formed by liturgy, music, preaching, and food. Dr. Walsh is a prolific author that you will note if you've taken a look at the table afterwards. Some of his books are for sale, and he'll be signing some of those books. But he has written on topics as diverse as biblical theology, worldview, nature, postmodernity, the city, homelessness, and music. If you do have questions at the end of his talk, we thought we would offer an opportunity for a question and answer session with microphones. Please come to the front at the end, and we'll have a short time for questions. And now, will you join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Walsh?
Good evening. Thank you, Anna Lee, for that kind introduction. It's an incredible honor to be with you this evening and these 2 days at this wonderful conference. I'm humbled that the Wendt character scholars this year have spent time reading my book, Beyond Homelessness, and I'm excited by what I've already heard in papers and presentations this afternoon and look forward to more conversation this evening and throughout tomorrow. Let me begin by telling you a story. Let me tell you about my former student, Charlene. Whenever Charlene would leave her family home, her mother would say, "Charlene, don't forget who you are." Not be careful, not be good, not don't get into trouble, but rather, "Charlene, don't forget who you are." Now, I don't know if Charlene's mom still says this to her grown-up daughter, mother, pastor of a Mennonite church, But she was certainly saying this well into Charlene's adulthood when I first met her as a graduate student. Don't forget who you are. And Charlene always received this bit of motherly advice, this parental word of wisdom and direction, as an affirmation. Charlene, don't forget who you are, because who you are is something to be held on to, something to remember. This injunction, don't forget who you are, was affirming both Charlene's character as a young Christian woman and the family story that had shaped her. As she would leave home, the place of her deepest formation, this place of family rituals and traditions where prayers were said and tears were shed, she would be encouraged to not forget. Don't fall into an amnesia about who you are. Don't forget your story. You may leave home, but you will only be homeless if you forget who you are. And if you forget who you are, then you won't know where you're going. You'll be disoriented, lost. You will lose the plot of your story. You'll begin to live out of character. It's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Out of character. Have you ever had a time when a parent said to you, or perhaps you said to a child or to a friend, "This isn't you"? Some behavior is surprising and disappointing, and someone says, "Annalee, this isn't you." That is, you're acting out of character. This is a behavior or an attitude that seems deeply inconsistent with how we have come to know and love you. We can't see how this character either lives out of the story of your life or furthers that story. Of course, there's another way that we could have put this. We could ask, "Annalee, what would your mother think?" Ah, yeah, the old appeal to your mother tactic. Now, the assumption behind asking such a question, "What would your mother think?" is that you had a mother and that she was like Charlene's mother. You had a home like Charlene's home. You were formed in a household of love, in a healthy, affirming, and appropriately disciplining family. The story of your life is a story worth continuing. This familiar story, the story of home, was life-giving. It was a story with a future, a story that was foundational to a profound sense of home that gave you a confidence in your life because that home was a safe place of belonging. It functioned as the center of your world. It was a generous place of hospitality. It was a secure space of permanence. It was a site of deep and affirming intimacy where you came to know who you were, where you were going, and what mattered most in life. And here's the rub. It sounds good, but I'm pretty sure that there are at least some people in this room who might be thinking, what home is he talking about? This happy experience of home, sweet home, maybe that wasn't your experience. Canadian singer-songwriter Bruce Cockburn put it this way, "Oh, sweet fantasia of the safe home, where nobody has to scrape for honey at the bottom of the comb, where everybody understands the scene and nobody ever means to be mean." Yeah, we'll catch it in a dream, catch it in a song, seek it on the street. You'll find the Candyman's gone. Lovely idea, this notion of a safe home. Sweet imagery, this site of affirming intimacy. Lovely sentiment, remembering who you are. Romantic dream, this place of belonging. Compelling thought, character shaped by home. It all sounds great. But if you seek it on the street, seek it amongst the chronically homeless, the runaway kids, the PTSD-inflicted veterans, the offspring of the ghetto, refugees running for their lives, or even the upwardly mobile nomads of the corporate elite, well, then it all just rings a little hollow, a sweet fantasia. And to tell you the truth, it all rang hollow for me growing up in the 60s. See, my mom never said, "Brian, don't forget who you are." And my alcoholic dad had split the scene in a mad dash, precisely to forget who he was. For me, there was no grounding story, no deep sense of home. And the highest character that I aspired to was to become a salesman for a multinational corporation and drive a sports car. In the words of the Beatles, I was a real nowhere man living in a nowhere land, making all my nowhere plans for nobody. Or in the words of Douglas Copeland, for me, home was little more than a shared electronic dream of cartoon memories, half-hour sitcoms, and national tragedies. That was the extent of the narrative of my life. Don't forget who I am. There was nothing worth remembering. There was too little sense of an identity to bother trying to conserve it. No wonder I would play Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone over and over on the jukebox. Back then, 10 cents for a song, 3 songs for a quarter. Generally, that would mean for 25 cents, you could get about 6.5 minutes of music, unless you played Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone. Then you could dominate the airways for 18 minutes. Now, it's not that I knew what the song was all about. And I hope that some of these young people will go and look up Bob Dylan. He is your heritage. Populated by images of Miss Lonely getting juiced at her private school, mystery tramps, chrome horses, and a diplomat with a Siamese cat on his shoulder, man, the song just came across as a catalog of surreal images designed to confuse. But there was something about the chorus, and it was playing where you came in, that rang true. How does it feel, Dylan sang? How does it feel to be on your own, with no direction home, like a complete unknown, like a rolling stone? This became something of an anthem of my generation. Lost, alone, directionless, profoundly homeless, living in a world of mass consumer anonymity. We were the Rolling Stone generation. Like the late capitalism that was our birthright, we were constantly mobile, but going nowhere. With no direction home, neither going back home nor having a vision of going forward to some new home, I had no idea of who I was, what role I was to play in the world, and how I, with my personalities, my gifts, my hang-ups, my brokenness, was to find my place in that world. This is character and the crisis of home. And so, as a 16-year-old kid, emotionally, culturally, and narratively homeless, I went looking for home. And I found it in the grungy basement of an inner-city mission in downtown Toronto. In the midst of a ministry to the poorest of the poor in the city of Toronto, I met a community of welcoming hospitality, a community with deep, deep resources of love. In the basement of the Yonge Street Mission, I encountered a radically new vision of hope, a community rooted in deep memories, an ancient story of a home-making God, a God who took on flesh in Jesus and moved into the neighborhood. And it was in that community that I came home, found home, and was welcomed home. The lonely kid was embraced by a community. The storyless kid walked into the story of Jesus. The fatherless kid became beloved of a heavenly Father. The confused kid, bored with the vacuous spirit of the age, was animated, enlivened, and given direction by the Spirit of God. This is restored home and the nurturing of character. This is a restoring of life and the reconstruction of home. Now, our topic this evening is home and the crisis of character. It's curious, isn't it, that character has been having something of a revival of late. Why are we talking so much about character these days? Who would have thought 25 years ago of a university establishing a whole initiative on character development? Why character? What's going on here? Well, might it be that we are talking so much about character precisely because of its lack? Might it be that we find it so necessary to reflect on character across disciplines and across our society because there's something going on culturally, educationally, economically, politically, and historically wherein we see a profound lack of character, or perhaps worse, it's the deformation of character. Indeed, the normalization of what we might have seen in the past as character faults and deficiencies. Remember Wall Street, the film, and the great speech about greed, how people say greed is evil, but greed is good. Because greed is the heart of capitalism. Greed is what makes the economy grow, so embrace greed. That would be the normalization of a vice. All of a sudden, and interestingly enough, greed has been part of every empire throughout history. It's the nature of empires to be greedy. But the modern Western empire of capitalism is actually the only one that has ever said greed is good. Greed is a virtue. Well, that creates certain problems. There's something wrong, and I think we all know that there's something wrong. And many of us have a hunch that what is wrong has something to do with character, with the loss of virtue. Both David Brooks and Richard Sennett, who have written books on character, argue that we live in a culture held captive by short-term, captive by the short-term notion of profit, of production, and economic growth. But the problem is that such a short-term way of life doesn't have the patience, wisdom, and virtue for the long-term fostering of something called character. Indeed, a culture with a short-term preoccupation with immediate gratification, a quick return on investments, an addictive relation to social media driven by the fear of missing out, an ever-flexible posture of keeping your options open that preclude deep commitment. Such a culture will necessarily be a culture that lacks any coherent narrative, coherent story that is deep enough to sustain the forming of virtuous character. Okay. Now, I acknowledge that I'm on thin ice here. And the ice has been getting thinner with climate change. Do you remember Stephen Colbert? So, first time I ever saw Colbert was speaking at the presidential press dinner. And there's President Bush right there. And I actually felt bad for President Bush at a certain point. I thought, this guy's just taking him apart. And at a certain point, he made a joke which had something of a punchline of moves as slow as a glacier. And he said, remember that joke. Your kids won't understand it. Your kids won't understand it because there won't be glaciers. So I'm on thin ice. I'm a guest in your country, a guest in the home of the brave, allowed in by your Homeland Security Department. But I'm not saying anything tonight I think that you don't already know. If I say that the crisis of character in America seems to have reached a critical point. The moral ecology of your body politic, and I make no nationalistic claims about the moral superiority of my own country. The moral ecology of your body politic would appear to be so compromised, so despoiled, that it is perilously close to being unable to sustain the moral nutrients necessary for a healthy nation, let alone engendering and encouraging moral character. Repeating patterns we have seen throughout the history of empires in decline. We see an uncontrolled lust for wealth in the highest office of the land. We see arrogance, deceit, petty lies, callousness, self-promotion, xenophobia, avarice, violence, indecency, misogyny, racism, emotional immaturity, alarming instability, intellectual incompetence, divisiveness, sexual degeneracy, callousness, and authoritarian paranoia. I didn't make that stuff up. That's all from American authors. And one of your prophets says, it is all spectacle and no substance, all narcissism and no empathy, all appetite and greed and no wisdom. Character and the crisis of home. Or perhaps we could say spiritual bankruptcy and the deformation of character. Or maybe moral ecology and the collapse of home. However we dance around these issues, it seems clear to me that home is at the heart of all these things. So let's dance. Well, it's a slow dance. Actually, it's more like a dirge, a lament. Okay, maybe we won't dance. Maybe we'll just sit for a bit and let the music and words wash over us. This is my friend Martin Joseph from Cardiff, Wales. You've probably never heard of him. But this song helps me to get to the heart of what I'm trying to say.
Well, the ashtrays are full, and today somehow some I'd asked for a sign, but the prophets are drunk. The sirens are telling the news of the night. Girls waiting for taxis have started to fight. Maybe a genie will quietly appear. Whoever it was that brought me here, it's time to take me home. Glory is missing from this hollow room, like a bride who knew better and jilted the groom. And I'm trying to work out what it is I should be. I'm a dented saint searching for some sanctuary, and I'm remembering grace and the things I hold dear. Whoever it was that brought me here, it's time to take me home. Take me home. Now the clowns and clairvoyants are aiming a true, and in the babble and the rabble, I'm still headed for you. And those masters of war, they will not go away. And though the bleak sky gets burdened, well, I pray anyway. And though ironies drain me, I'll now try sincere. Whoever it was that brought me here, whoever it was, whoever you are, whoever it was that brought me here, it's time to take me home. It's time to take me home.
whoever it was that brought me here, it's time to take me home. In the face of the crisis of home, in a world of displacement, indeed in a dissing of place in the name of upward mobility, in the name of economic growth at all costs, in a culture of all-pervasive homelessness, the artist sings, whoever it was that brought me home, brought me here, it's time to take me home. Musically, the song is performed with the emotional exhaustion evoked in the opening line. The ashtrays are full, and today's somehow sunk. This day has got away from me, and all I've got left to show for it are my overflowing ashtrays. Somehow it just all went up in smoke. Somehow my home is reduced to a cancer-ridden waste site. Is this what home has become? Might this home of futility, waste, and disease be symbolic of our culture? How can we be at home at such a site? How is character shaped in such a despoiled home? When it comes right down to it, who am I? What is my identity? Where am I going, sitting here at the end of another wasted day, another day devoid of meaning, devoid of calling? In the first few bars of music and in the very opening line of the song, a deep depression is evoked. I know that depression. I meet it every day in my work as a campus minister. Indeed, it would be an understatement to say that our culture is presently experiencing an epidemic of depression. So, the artist, an epidemic of depression. And depression and disorientation, they always go hand in hand. How can you have a sense of direction in life when you're weighted down in depression? Depression robs you of hope as it eats away at your sense of identity. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Don't put up your hands. So the artist says that he would ask for a sign, some sense of meaning, some direction home, some insight into the depths of this malaise, and maybe some hope for a path beyond the crisis. But dang, the prophets are drunk. There is no prophetic word, no oracle of homecoming, no path beyond the state of exile. Maybe the prophets have drowned their sorrows in drink, and that's why they have no clear-eyed vision to offer. Well, might the sirens of night wake up those prophets? Might those sirens pierce through our numbed-out slumber? Or have we heard them all before? These sirens tell us the news of the night, but also of the day. The sirens from another school shooting. Another day of rampage, another day bearing witness to the fetish of the gun, the character-destroying fear that cloaks itself in the Second Amendment. Violence begets violence. Bloodshed begets bloodshed. It has always been so. No wonder these girls waiting for taxis have started to fight. So what do you think? Is some genie going to quietly appear to lead us out of this crisis of character, this culture of insecurity and violence? Not likely. But, sings Martin Joseph, whoever it was that brought me here will have to take me home. Now, I think that you would be hard-pressed to find a great song or an important novel, an epic poem, or a good film that wasn't about home. It's all about home, home lost, or the threat to home, and home regained. It's all about the torturous and dangerous journey home. Whether we're reading Homer's Odyssey or the grand biblical narrative of creation, fall, and redemption, whether we're talking about the myths of all indigenous peoples the world over, or J.R.R. Tolkien's trilogy of the Ring, it's all about leaving home and finding a path back home. From African American spirituals during the time of slavery to hip-hop written out of the ghetto of racist America, From the bluegrass of Appalachia to the longings of Bruce Springsteen, from the blues to country and western, the longing for home, the lament over its loss, the pathos over its failed promise is a ubiquitous theme in our best music. From the protection and opening up of home in a film like Black Panther to the classic Wizard of Oz, the refrain is pretty much the same. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. Now, I've already suggested that character is rooted in narrative. We live out of our stories, and that the most foundational narratives are the narratives of home. But we now need to reflect for a moment on how those narratives of home get shaped. See, Charlene's mom had a habit, indeed it was a ritual, of encouraging her daughter to remember who she is every time she leaves the family home. And that ritual only makes sense, it only has power because it is itself an outworking and an expression of other rituals and other habits. You see, if sexual abuse was habitual in Charlene's home, then this doorway ritual would have been meaningless at best and mockingly cruel at worst. Remember who you are, darling, the abused child of a family of sexual exploitation and very dirty secrets. No. This ritual of reminding Charlene to remember who she is makes sense because it is a natural expression of a life together filled with all kinds of other habits that have shaped Charlene's character. Homemade meals, learning how to cook, daily prayers, support in her endeavors as a child, a life of hospitality, her parents engaging in ministries of justice, family vacations, gardening, open conversations around the dinner table, active life in their church, Bible reading, affirmation of Charlene's gifts, an ethos of service, family games, rather than screen addiction. These and many more habits, these daily ways of living together, provided the template for the story of Charlene's life and shaped the character that she was encouraged never to forget. I'm going to have to get a little technical for a second. See, perhaps the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu can help us. Bourdieu's notion of habitus is helpful. Habitus. I should have had a slide for this. The word habit, add us to the end. Habitus. Habitus. Somewhat akin to the concept of worldview, and I know many of you take a course in worldview here. Bourdieu described habitus as a way of being, a habitual state, a disposition, tendency, a propensity or inclination to behave in certain ways. And a habitus is formed, unsurprisingly, by habits. A habitual way of living in the everyday rituals of life shapes our habitus, our dispositions, our propensities, the way in which we inhabit the world, our character. A habitus is that nexus of dispositions, ways of being in the world, that gets internalized as second nature. It's internalized as second nature through the simple act of living with certain kinds of habitual behaviors. You've always done this, it must be just the way it is. So if character is rooted in home, and home is formed around rituals and habits, then we could say that home is a site of habituation. Habituation, that's what you do when you raise children. You are habituating them. We used to say socializing them, same thing. You are habituating them through certain kinds of practices. And you'll find with children that habitual practices are very, very important. Bedtime rituals. Bedtime rituals. Go sidebar for a second. We had at our farm a number of years ago a woman and her daughter. We had them at the farm for pastoral reasons. And the daughter had probably been sexually abused at maybe the age 3. She was 4. And she's trying to figure out who she is and what is her place in the world. And we made a mistake that summer. Little Kaylee wanted to negotiate every dinner time about where she would sit. We have a table. We have about 8 people at that table every night. And every night, this little girl is having a negotiation and an argument about where she's going to sit. And I think she ended up being incredibly confused and insecure. She already was, and it just made it worse. What we should have done at the beginning of the summer is we should have said, Callie, this is your seat. You sit here. We're putting you between the 2 big girls because you love them, and that gives your mom a break. She doesn't have to take care of you, but this will be your seat. If we had done that, I think that small little act would have helped that little girl. And we missed it, for which I'm very sad. So, home is a site of habituation. It's the habitat, right? Just like all creatures have habitats. It's the habitat in which we are formed to be who we are, and it forms us into who we are by shaping our desire. All habits, all rituals, all experiences of home, and indeed all formation of character has a telos. It's going someplace. We do these things, we live this way because they lead us in a direction towards a goal, a telos, an end that we have habitually come to anticipate as the good life, that which is to be most highly desired. My colleague James Smith argues that these tangible, visceral, repeated practices carry a story about human flourishing that we learn in unconscious ways. For example, no one had to convert us to the habitus of consumerism. No one had to sit down and do catechism in the worldview of consumerism to convince us of the truth of this way of life. Rather, we find ourselves covertly conscripted into a way of life because we've been formed by cultural practices that are nothing less than secular liturgies. All we needed to do to demonstrate our devotion was to go to the mall and shop. You see, if we are unreflectively immersed in these liturgies of consumerism, we will over time learn that the end goal of human life is acquisition and consumption. But can such a goal, such a telos, indeed such consumptive desire, lead us home? Or might Oberlin's David Orr have been right when he described compulsive consumption as a form of grieving in response to the fact that we find ourselves exiles and strangers in a diminished world that we once called home? It's a coping mechanism. Could it be that the dominant habitus of our culture is in fact a habitus that can produce no sustaining habitat? Might we be caught up in a habitus of homelessness? Might the sheer emptiness of our consumerist way of life be reflected in this crisis of home and the degradation of character in our time? Well, my buddy Martin Joseph thinks so. You see, the glory is missing, he sings, from this hollow room. The glory is missing. That's the heart of the problem. Isn't that why we need to make America great again? Isn't this the rhetoric of all empires in decline? The glory is missing. The glory of the republic is waning. The esteem it held in the world is fading. The clear exceptionality of this nation, it just rings hollow. We need to regain this glory, because without that glory, well, what happens to our sense of home? What happens to our calling, our manifest destiny, our character as a nation and a people? Yes, departed glory is a constant theme when civilizations are in crisis. But I wonder if there might also be an ancient biblical reference here. From the prophet Ezekiel on. Ezekiel in the room? Met him outside. Got a brother outside named Ezekiel. From the prophet Ezekiel on, Israel experienced their exile in terms of the departure of the glory of God from the temple. The room is hollow because the glory has departed. There's no presence, there's no weight, there's no glory. We are homeless because God has left the building. God is no longer on our side. God can no longer be expected to bless America. This was never a domesticated God. And God no longer resides in temples. Not our temples, not anybody else's. Our culture has become too facile, it's too empty, it's too unbearably light to host the weighty presence of God. And so, like a bride who knew better and jilted the groom, we are facing the homelessness of aborted covenant. And when the covenant is broken, when our idolatrous infidelity has done its home-wrecking worst, when home is no longer received as a covenantal gift, then we are rendered homeless. Covenant binds us to each other, to community, to the very earth, and to God. Without covenant, we are cast adrift. We have no moorings, no anchor, no direction home. And once again, the crisis of home is a crisis of character. It's a crisis of identity. I'm trying to find out what it is I should be. Who am I if I'm homeless? Perhaps I'm reduced to a dented saint searching for some sanctuary. Dented saints looking for home in a culture of displacement. Dented saints looking for a place of safety in a culture of violence and deportation. Dented saints looking for healing in a time of deep, deep wounds. Dented saints looking for a place of sanctity in a culture of violation and abuse. That's what home is. Or at least that begins to get at what home is. A site of placed identity, a refuge of safety and welcome, a place of healing, a holy place, a sanctuary. But there can be no home if the glory is missing. There can be no home if covenant is aborted. And there can be no home apart from memory and grace. I'm remembering grace and the things I hold dear. Just as an aside, my friend Martin Joseph has not read this. And I just think it's wonderful that he wrote this song that gave me a basic outline of everything I wanted to say. Now whether he would believe any of this, I don't know. But he wrote a great song. I'm remembering grace and the things I hold dear. As we have seen, home is all about stories of grace. There is no home without memory, and there is no home apart from grace. And so, in the face of aborted covenant, in the face of a story that has gone terribly wrong, in the face of a story that has degenerated into homeless enmity, in the lonely hollowness of homelessness, the emptiness of homelessness, the artist remembers. Like the psalmists before him, the contemporary psalmist remembers grace. He remembers covenant. He remembers all that he holds dear. Maybe it's the smell of his grandma's kitchen, the sound of his father's snoring, the feel of his lover's body, the touch of his firstborn child, the creak of the third step from the bottom, the songs that were sung around the table, the tears that were shed, the deaths that were mourned, the accomplishments celebrated, and the prayers that were uttered. And even when those memories are broken, even when they are memories of home-breaking abuse, enmity, and betrayal, I believe that somehow there resides in all of us an even deeper memory. A memory somehow before memory. A memory of home that births the longing for home in the face of its absence. A memory that arouses our deepest longings, our most profound, inescapable desires for home. Memories of a home deeply, deeply rooted in the divine homemaker. Home with our Creator. Everybody believes that, except secular Westerners. Everybody around the world believes that, except secular Westerners. The glory is missing in this hollow room. And that very lack somehow calls forth this deepest of memories. We remember, and in remembering there is the possibility of coming home. But there is also a deepening of the ache, because we realize anew how far we are from that home. So whoever it was that brought me here will have to take me home. You see, the clowns and clairvoyants, the pundits and experts, the spin doctors and public relations firms may be aiming at something they think is true, but this artist is heading somewhere else. This manufactured truth won't help him. Their babble and rabble won't point him towards home. This cacophony of our culture, with all of its noise but so little meaning, isn't going anywhere that will address our crisis. So, the artist turns off his social media, closes his Twitter and Instagram accounts, and heads somewhere else. In the babble, the rabble, I'm still headed for you. Or as Bono once put it, when I go there with you, it's all I can do. There's no such thing as home alone. There's no such thing as home without community. There's no such thing as home apart from fellowship. And again, homemaking is impossible outside of covenant. It's true that Bob Dylan's Masters of War never did go away. They still lie and deceive. A nuclear war can be won, they want us to believe. They still hide in their mansions while the young people's blood flows out of their bodies and is buried in the mud. It's true that war still renders millions homeless. It's true that war begets war. It's true that war also begets refugees, homeless vets on the streets of our cities, and broken homes in those faraway lands together with broken homes in our own communities. You see, war is nothing less than domicide, the murder of home, somebody's home. And while we used to think that war built character, that our warriors came home as heroes, people of courage, loyalty, and compassion, we now know that PTSD is a debilitating condition, rendering the warrior lost, confused, and plagued with guilt. You cannot endure the savagery of war, nor can you engage in acts of violence and death without having a devastating impact on your character as a human being. It's impossible. And all of this only makes the artist long for home more deeply. You see, though the bleak sky is burdened, I'll pray anyway. All of creation bears the sad scars of our homelessness. The bleak sky is burdened with our pollution, burdened with the very creation which is to be our home is now becoming increasingly uninhabitable. Isn't that a devastating irony? Our cultural habitus consists of habits that render our creational habitat increasingly uninhabitable for ourselves and for so many of our creaturely kin. This is, if you will, a habitus for homelessness. But our artist, he's going to pray anyway. He'll pray along with the rest of creation. He'll pray for redemption, for homecoming. He'll pray in the face of the home-breaking evidence. He'll add his lament to the groaning of the creation. And he'll even pray in the face of the doubts and disappointments that reside in his own heart. He knows all about postmodern disillusionment. He's walked the path of disappointment. He's learned to be comfortable with fragmentation. He's played the game of postmodern irony. He knows all about that self-possessed inability to engage his own or anyone else's homelessness with a seriousness and a weight and a longing. But today he sings, though ironies drained me, I'll now try sincere. Let's strip off the mask of bankrupt liberalism. Let's stop playing the game of being okay with disorientation. Let's abandon a cool and hip cultural nomadism. And let's try an honesty that faces our own lonely homelessness and the degradation of character in our time. I assume that is what we're doing here at this conference on character in place. I assume that we gather not simply out of some academic curiosity, but out of something like the postmodern longing and pathos for home that we meet in Martin Joseph's song. But Martin has been saying something else all along. He's been sharing with us an insight that could save our lives. He's been confessing something that goes to the heart of our homeless plight and can provide us the only way home. It's been there at the end of each verse. Whoever it was that brought me here will have to take me home. Home is not an achievement. Home is a gift. Home is not an accomplishment. Home is a gift. Home is at heart not something we construct. Home is a gift. This doesn't mean that we don't work to make home or work to shape character. It doesn't mean we don't construct home. What it does mean is that in the end, when we have a deep experience of home, when we see a person or a people or a nation demonstrating deep character, when we meet real virtue in the flesh, it always comes as a gift. It always comes with surprise. It always comes in grace. Maybe that is why at the end of the song, the artist makes it personal. Whoever it was that brought me here, whoever it was that brought me here, you're going to have to come and take me home. You are going to have to come and take me home. The glory is missing. God is homeless. And until the glory returns, until God brings us home, we will remain in our homelessness. The song has been a prayer from the beginning. Actually, most great songs are prayers. This particular prayer, as our sisters might tell us, is Augustinian, isn't it? Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee, St. Augustine wrote. Our hearts are homeless until they find their home in thee. This is a prayer of longing, a prayer of homecoming, and at heart, that's what all prayers are. To cite Bruce Cockburn again, this is too big for anger, it's too big for blame. We stumble through history so humanly lame, so I bow down my head, say a prayer for us all, that we won't fear the Spirit when it comes to call. This is not the facile piety of our thoughts and prayers are with the victims that we hear with every new tragedy. No, this is prayer that engages the crisis of home. This is prayer in the midst of devastation. This is prayer that recognizes that character, virtue, and healing are all beyond the reach of our best autonomous efforts. But this is not a prayer of passivity. You see, prayer without justice is blasphemy. Prayer without compassion is empty. Prayer without action is a lie. We pray for homecoming as we work hard to be homemakers. We pray for renewal of character as we embrace redemptive, virtue-forming habits in our day-to-day lives. And in the biblical perspective, our prayer for homecoming is not a prayer to be whisked off to some heaven far away, but rather to be restored to who we were always called to be in this world, here on this earth, at this time. Now, from a biblical perspective, there are all kinds of reasons for the deformation of character and the crisis of home in our time. And idolatry would be at the heart of the matter. Consumerism, racism, nationalism, militarism, imperialism, sexism would perhaps be the leading contenders for the idolatry at the root of our malaise. And all of these idolatries are domicidal. They are all home-destroying forces, home-murdering forces that result in the degradation of character precisely because these idolatries feed off of a disordered desire, a misplaced love. But idolatry is a distortion of human life. You see, in biblical faith, humans are created in the image of God. We are created to bear the likeness of God, to image our loving, sustaining, and blessing Creator. Humans cannot opt out of the call to be image bearers. It's built into our very creation, our DNA, our uniqueness as the creatures that we are. So when humans rebel against their Creator, they rebel against the very nature and calling, their very nature and calling, as creatures created in the image of God. And in that rebellion, in that home breaking, that severing of covenant, we necessarily, invariably, and without exception, every single time, will always give our lives in the service of another image. The creature created in the image of God turns to graven images. Idolatry is the primal expression of misdirected love, disordered desire. And God says, don't forget who you are. And God says, this is not who you are. From a biblical perspective, the path to restored character, the path beyond our present crisis, is the path home. Home to who we are. Home to our foundational calling. Home to our Creator. But let's be crystal clear about one thing here. The path home is not the path to heaven. This could have been the topic for a whole different lecture. But let me put it this way. If the telos, the ultimate end of our story, is eternal life in some otherworldly heaven, then we will never be the people of character that we need to be to restore any semblance of home, virtue, justice in the world in which we live. We will be so heavenly minded, we'll be no earthly good. The doctrine of heavenly hope, conceived in terms of Plato's dualism between heaven and earth, eternity and time, the sacred and the mundane, that dualism will always militate against the formation of deep human character in this world and for this world. You see, in biblical faith, we were not created for heaven. We are creatures of the earth for the earth. In terms of the opening chapters of the Bible, we are primordially and eternally earth creatures. Actually, more literally, mud creatures. We are Hadam of the Hadamah. That's what the name Adam means. It's a play on the word Hadamah. Hadamah means earth. The first human is an earth creature formed out of the dust. We are humans of the humus. And we bear the image of God as earth creatures in our homemaking service in and for the earth. And this is what we have lost in our idolatry. And this loss is given false theological legitimation precisely by this dualism. Both idolatry and dualism distort our desire, misdirect our character, destroy home, and embed us in stories not worth remembering. But this is not who we are. In God's eyes, and in our most powerful story, our deepest of all memories, we are more than what we have become. We are beautiful, though all of the evidence suggests otherwise. We are strong, though we feel so powerless before the crisis in which we live. And we can be brave, though bravery has been so distorted by the image of the violent hero. I said earlier that we are facing an epidemic of depression in our time. But a therapist friend of mine corrected me the other day on this. No, she said, not depression, anxiety. We are living through an epidemic of anxiety. For so many, it feels like it is all falling apart. Our fears are overwhelming. We feel as if we are too weak to hold it together. Exhausted and depleted, those sirens of the night, that emergency bell ringing in our souls, that sense of loss, loneliness, and homelessness has left us paralyzed in the face of it all, cursed with the curse of these modern times. But that is not the end of the story. You see, the telos of biblical faith is a restored creation where God will dwell with us anew and the glory returns and fills the earth. Our deepest hope is for a new creation, a restored earth, a redeemed and healed home, where weeping and sorrow will be no more, where the cry of distress will be heard no more, where lives will be cut short by violence no flippin' more, where dispossession and homelessness will be no more, where walls of exclusion and policies of deportation will be no more, where exploitation will be no more, where meaningless and demeaning labor will be no more, where children will be born for calamity no more, where ecological despoliation and collapse will be no more. No more, no more, no more. Before we call, God will answer. God will turn a deaf ear to us no more. You see, my friends, in the end, love wins big. The world that was created out of the overflowing, generous, and extravagant love of the Creator finds its ultimate telos and end precisely in that love. Don't forget who you are. And don't forget where you are going. Don't forget that you were created in love. You are called to love. And love is your deepest and most authentic desire. So, my friends, if you're drifting away, if it's falling apart, just let yourself be quietly drawn to the stronger call of what you really love. Abandon those false loves and be embraced by that deeper love, the love in which and for which you were created. Let that love whisper to your fears and wrestle with the noise, the sirens, the babble, the rabble of this night. My friend Martin Joseph puts it this way: I need you brave, I want you brave, I need you strong to sing along. You are so beautiful, and I am not wrong. And you can bring it on, world, throw everything, because in the end, love wins big, and there are some of us who will not be lying down. May that be so, my friends. May that be so. I think that I'm going to let Martin have the final word tonight. This is his song, Let Yourself.
I need you brave, I want you brave, I need you strong. Sing along, you're beautiful, but I'm not wrong. And even today, this timeline, it is fine, enough for us to find a path ahead. Let this whole thing roll on. But if you're drifting away, if it's falling apart, just let yourself be quietly drawn by the stronger call of what you really love. Let your soul, the one that you brought with you safe to this moment in time, whisper to your fears and wrestle with the noise of the night for you. If we could just step outside and look at ourselves for a moment, we might see there's a different way than we can be. Do not expect to find all the answers of this world, 'cause if you could somehow and then you did tell me, who the hell would you be? But if you're drifting away, if it's falling apart, yeah, just let yourself be quietly drawn by the stronger call of what you really love, and let your soul, the one that you brought with you safe to this moment in time, Whisper to your fears and wrestle with the noise of the night for you. And in the midst of these moments, well, it's like we've never left. Been in a lifetime of returning, we are not home yet. This is not home yet. And I need you brave, I want you brave, I need you strong. When you sing along, it is so beautiful. I am not wrong. And you can bring it on, world, you throw everything, 'cause in the end love wins big. And there are some of us who will not be lying down. But if you're drifting away, are you falling apart? You just let yourself be quietly drawn by the stronger call of what you really love, and let your soul is the one that you brought with you safe to this moment in time. Whisper to your fears and wrestle with the noise of the night. May to whisper to your fears and wrestle with the noise of the night for you.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen.